Welcome to Gold Derby. I'm senior editor Denton Davidson here with Lisa Cortes, director of Little Richard, I Am Everything. This is a legacy piece that explores his music, his roots, his queerness, his religion. It's really all-encompassing. There are many celebrities and icons worthy of a documentary like this, but why Little Richard for you, and why now?
Little Richard's music obviously is infectious, but his story is so intriguing. There's many facets of his contribution to the foundation of rock and roll that people don't know. I think we all hold this image of this person who was a caricature, who was telling people to shut up, and we didn't understand what was underlying there, his pain for a lack of recognition. But also it's a film that is talking about erasure. It's talking about erasure at a time where many parts of our country there are movements to not tell the totality of queer history and also of Black history. And so Little Richard's passing in the spring of 2020 really became a beacon to explore not only what made him such an incredible icon, but also the cultural landscape that he existed in many ways was such a tremendous force for change.
There were so many things that surprised me to learn about him through this film. What surprised you the most?
Well, Little Richard's life is quite a roller coaster. There's numerous surprises, but what was interesting was a discovery of his time as Princess Lavone. So after this kid who's born in Macon, Georgia, is kicked out of his home in his teens for being queer, he not only is taken in by a queer bar in Macon and TikTok, okay, right there. It's like, this does not make sense in the 1940s with what we have been told is a history. And then the next part is Princess Lavone, the character that Little Richard takes on when he performs in drag, and how that part of his story intersects with a greater drag history and speaks to this idea that Americans are not as conservative as many people would like to tell us we are. There have always been spaces for Little Richard, for Sister Rosetta Tharpe, for queer people to contribute and to be a part of the rich cultural texture of our country.
There's so much footage of him throughout his career and so many interviews he did. He was basically able to narrate this film, which I loved. How did you sort through so many decades of footage to decide what you wanted to use for the film? What's that process entail?
When I started working on this film and did my research, what was very apparent to me was it was necessary to give Little Richard the agency to tell his story. And that was, I think, a constant theme in his life of not being given his complete voice in his totality. Yes, we heard his musical voice. And so at the beginning of the project, I asked the archival producers to do a really huge sweep to make certain that we could identify Richard as a narrator for his cradle to grave story, and was really lucky to work with Rich Remsburg and Ginnity and Kennedy, who helped with that task. And then our editors came on board, Nenev Minier, Jay Kostatter, and they started working with me to pull those moments that we thought really were Richard as narrator, but with great emotionality and a sense of he's not just telling the story, he's giving you great stories about not only his relationships, but also his craft.
There was this constant push and pull with Richard in his life. He went from rock star to Christian, from drug addict to saved, from gay to converted and married. Did you get the sense he ever really got what he was seeking in life, or was able to come to terms with that? Because those were some of the most surprising things to me. I have this image of growing up and seeing him, and I don't remember like the gospel years, but he was singing those gospel songs, but I don't, that's not a Richard I remember.
Yeah, that Richard is one who is involved with the Adventist community. That if you're not in that community, you would not have seen and heard that material. It, I think that Richard was able to come to terms with everything through his relationship with God. I do not believe, though, that he was able to hold on to the totality of all that he contained. And that's part of the richness of the journey. It is not a linear story, it is one that is looking at Richard's impact on the greater world and pop culture, but it's also looking at the tumultuous interiority of his life. And it is a story that many people relate to, you know, the sacred and the profane. How can they live together? And it is the churn in this story that affects his music performances, his relationships, and ultimately his giving up rock and roll. And I think that's what makes him so rich. And this is not just a jukebox musical.
He was incredibly overlooked as an artist, and his contributions to music for decades. In 1997, he got this American Music Award, the Award for Merit. And that was an emotional moment for him. He's on stage crying. This was really the first time that he's been recognized for inspiring all of these rock stars, essentially everyone that has come after him. What do you think? Do you think his flamboyant personality or the way he dressed was one of the reasons that he was overlooked in that way? Because we don't see Ray Charles joked about like that. We don't see Stevie Wonder talked about like that. Do you think society was not able to accept him in some ways? Is that part of what was oppressing him or the respect he was getting?
I think it's a combination of his voicing his outrage. You know, you're not supposed to say you're unhappy with a system. And it's a system in his case that took tremendous advantage of him. You know, he only got $250 for writing Tutti Frutti. He gave away all of his rights. And so much of the pushback, as his former manager said, it was he was outspoken, he was black, and he was gay. And we know that that's not the an approach that is welcomed in our culture. We're supposed to take what we get. And you know, I think we have to applaud Richard for continuously pulling out the receipts and calling people on it.
And one of the other things that intrigued me so much is he was not just black during segregation and gay during segregation. What I loved about the film is that you interviewed people who were in his band and they were not gay, but they loved him. I mean, they followed him everywhere. Was that interesting to you to see people of that time and of that era that were so supportive? These are some stories that we don't hear of people that don't exist in a lot of our minds.
It didn't surprise me at all. You know, I know the story from my aunties, my grandmother, about the queer man who worked at the beauty parlor, who they loved and was their best friend. And so in our community, you know, there's the stories that we know about that haven't really been part of the popular narratives that have been presented. And Richard's generosity is a constant that I heard about from everyone that I interviewed. He might have been a larger than life, sometimes challenging figure, but he also cared and looked out for people who had less than him. And I think that, kindness always trumps any kind of barriers that people might have about someone who they think is different from them.
Mick Jagger, Billy Porter, John Waters. These are a few people you interview for this project. How do you decide who to choose? Who do you want commentary from on his career and his contribution to music and pop culture?
When I'm working on a project and doing my research, I'm always thinking of a couple of buckets: family and friends, in this case, musicians who worked with Richard, people who are part of the legacy, and my pundits. So with Mick Jagger, I just thought people have never really talked to him about the very special connection that the Stones had with Little Richard. As we know from the film, Mick tells us they were a bar band. They only had a cover tune out, and they opened for him 30 nights in a row. And he sat there transfixed by Richard's performance and learned so much over that 30 days, 30 nights, I should say. It's a part of Mick Jagger's DNA now. Billy Porter, it was fantastic to speak with because he is the legacy and he can live his life in a way that Richard never was able to. And I thought that was a really important part of the conversation. When I'm making films, I just don't want it to be in the past tense. I want the past to be in conversation with contemporary issues. And then John Waters, not only is his mustache a tribute to Little Richard, but when I think of Hairspray, like Hairspray, that both the musical, the movie, and the original, film by John Waters is talking about this very important time with rock and roll, where rock and roll is bringing white and black kids together. So even though you watch Hairspray and you're thinking, about John Travolta playing the mom, there's much deeper commentary contained in that film about this desire to keep white and black kids apart and how the music was a very important bridge. So John Waters was there for so many reasons. And I don't know, Hairspray is also one of my favorite films.
Well, this was certainly a great film as well. Congratulations, Lisa, on your Critics' Choice Documentary Award nomination and this wonderful film about Little Richard. Thanks for discussing it with Gold Derby today.
Thank you.